So welcome back to the second part of our conference, and I don't want to say too much except that everybody here in the room who would like to join us at 6:30 at the Lux for a reception is very, very welcome to do so, please. And if you need extra details or extra information, please talk to me in the break after this session. And now I'm going to hand over the podium to our moderator, Samuel Omans, who is one of our pre-doc fellows here, and he's going to introduce and then moderate the Q&A. Okay.
Thanks, Alexa, and good afternoon. Welcome back. We're going to continue this morning's stimulating discussion by moving now to Asia on a panel entitled, a session rather titled "To Territory and Mobility in Early Asian Monumentality." And our first speaker will be Guolong Lai, who is Associate Professor of Chinese Art and Archaeology at the University of Florida, where he teaches Chinese art and cultural studies. His research interests also include Chinese paleography, Old Chinese phonology, excavated manuscript studies, museology, collecting history, provenance studies, and the history of heritage conservation in modern China. His 2015 book, Excavating the Afterlife, The Archaeology of Early Chinese Religion, was published by the University of Washington Press and received an honorable mention from the Society for American Archaeology. He's co-edited a number of books in English and Chinese, most recently Unmasking Ideology in Imperial and Colonial Archaeology and New Philology in the Study of Early China, both in 2018. He's currently associate editor of the Zhejiang University Journal of Art and Archaeology and the Bulletin of Jiao Zhengyi Academy of Sinology in Hong Kong. He's been recipient of a number of prestigious grants and is currently a scholar here at the Getty Research Institute. So join me in welcoming Guolong.
Thank you very much, Sam, for the introduction. I want thank the GCI and particularly Alexa and Mary. This has been a wonderful year. I came with a clear plan to write a book, but the interaction with the scholars and fellows at the Getty Center helped me think more clearly and theoretically, while participation in the Villa events opened up my horizon for the other part of the ancient world. So as a result, I have to go back to the drawing board again. So clearly I have more work to do, more book to read, but I'm sure this will make my project richer and better. So today I will just pick two case studies to illustrate what my book project will be. So the topic of my project is the role of monumentality played in the formation of early Chinese empire, the Qing and Han Empire. And these three cases are the famous Terracotta Army and the capital city planning of Xianyang and Chang'an, and the establishment of the stele as a monumental form in Imperial China. So before I discuss my case, a few words on the term of monumentality is in order. So as some of you may know, the Chinese art historian Wu Hong's famous book entitled Monumentality in Early Chinese Art and Architecture. But my understanding of this term is a little bit different from his. He dismissed the common definition of monuments as a Western cultural construct, inadequate for the analysis of non-Western monument. Instead, he relied on what he called multiple Chinese conceptions of monumentality that goes beyond the physical form and denote memory, continuity, political, ethical, and the religious obligation to a tradition. So this permitted him to use these constantly changing conceptions of monumentality to organize his 5 chapters of case study together into a book. Wu's approach has been heavily criticized within the early Chinese field, but I think theoretically there's nothing wrong with his definition of monumentality. In fact, there are theoretical merits to emphasize the diversity of forms and meanings in the historical monuments and monumentality. But his claim to have discovered a long-forgotten indigenous Chinese notions of monumentality is unsubstantiated and historically inaccurate. So in fact, he and his Chinese translator had a hard time to coming up with suitable Chinese terms, a Chinese translation for this term of monumentality. Eventually, they coined a very awkward neologism, 纪念碑信, literally mean the character of commemorative stone steles. So the stone stele, 纪念碑, was originated in the Qing and Han period and took their early form in the commemorative inscription erected during the first emperor's inspection tours of newly conquered empire. For these reasons, in my proposed project, I plan to revive the common understanding of monuments and monumentality to study Qing and Han imperial art and archaeology. While some might complain that monumentality is an ethic concept, it's a modern Western terminology. But I think it is, as do many of modern scientific concepts, valid and useful as an analytical category in Chinese contexts. I will benefit from the recent theoretical and comparative study of monuments and monumentality, and in particular, take both a relational and phenomenological approach to analyze the phenomenon of monumentality in early China. So many scholars have traced the evolution of the semantic changes of monuments and monumentality. To summarize, the common notion of monuments and monumentality refer to at least the 3 aspects. The first is the etymological meaning of monuments. It's the commemorative structure. And the second is the monumental effect, the size, the scale, the grandiose effect of the monuments. And the third refers to the materiality, the permanence, durability. Although, for example, Ruskin never used the adjective of monumental in this wider sense, he was concerned with the emotional effect of great architecture. He associated with the sublime with such characteristics as great size and great scale. So the term monumentality is a relatively modern and Western notion, but this does not mean that there's not an equivalent in early China. Here I want to quote a conversation between the founder of Han Dynasty Empire and his prime minister. So this is a passage from Siji, the records a grand historian. So Liu Bang, the founder of the Han Dynasty, the emperor returned from his military expedition, and he saw the magnificent palace and towers that his prime minister, Xiao He, constructed. And he was very angry. He said, the empire is still in great turmoil. And those, although we have toiled in battle these several years, we cannot tell yet whether or not we will achieve final success. What do you mean by constructing palaces like this on such an extravagant scale? Xiao He replied, it is precisely because the fate of the empire is still uncertain that we must build such palaces and halls. A true son of heaven takes the whole world within the 4 seas to be his family. If he does not dwell in magnificence and beauty, he will have no way to manifest his authority. With these words, Liu Bang's anger turned to delight. Here, the magnificent and beauty, 壮丽, of the Han Imperial Palace refer to exactly the grandiose effect of the Imperial Palace. We might just call it a monumentality. So this notion of monumentality this is a Chinese, classical Chinese definition of this Chinese term, 壮丽, literally meaning magnificent and beauty, but to give the sense of emotional sense, the sense of grandeur of the newly constructed imperial palace. So this notion of a monumentality also agreed with Golden Child definition of monuments in archaeology, where different types of the monuments were the milestone of social complexity, the evolution from village to state and to empire. In the process of social evolution, monuments can be milestones to indicate the social complexity. And in Chinese context, this monumentality is often portrayed negatively as 好大喜功. This is another Chinese term found in dictionary. And actually, in the traditional China, there's also the monumentality and anti-monumentality debate in China. The comments of a later Chinese historian, a later philosopher and statesman, Sima Guang, comments on the passage I just talked about, the conversation between Liu Bang and Xiao He. The kings take benevolence and righteousness as their beauty, and morality and virtue as their authority. I never heard that palaces could conquer all under heaven. So this kind of debate was constantly present in Chinese traditional political discourse. You have two schools of politicians and statesmen talking about in the imperial policy, whether or not you build a grand, big style, or you emphasize your self-cultivation, morality, and virtue. So much for the notion of monumentality in early China. Now we start to look at what role monumentality played in the formation of Qing Han Empire. The first case study is the famous Terracotta Army. The Terracotta Army is the most famous item in early Chinese art. There's tons of scholarship on it. And Professor Steinhardt and I, we had a project together several years ago in the Asian Art Museum of Singapore. And I wrote an article on the Terracotta Warrior, the invention of this icon in the modern reception of this image. So they're altogether about 8,000 life-size figures in 3 pits, about 1 mile east of the first emperor's mausoleum. In 1974, was accidentally discovered by a local farmer who was digging agricultural wells in the field. In July 12, 1975, the Xinhua News, the Chinese news agency, officially announced the discovery of Terracotta Army. When the news reached the West, some scholars thought it was another political stunt that Chinese government played during the Cultural Revolution, because the Terracotta Army is completely out of place in the known development of Chinese art history. How to explain this phenomenon? Where did the Terracotta Army came from? The question boiled down to whether or not the Terracotta Army belonged to the same artistic tradition with other Chinese art. These are a group of ceramic figures excavated in the Han Dynasty, the Han Yangling, the early Han emperor's tomb. And they're about 60 centimeters high. And the average size of the Terracotta Army is 180 centimeters. So 3 times of this image. And before that, in the Warring States, before the unification of China, before the imperial time, the Chinese sculpture, the Chinese funerary ceramics are very tiny. So this is a scale view of the normal, common, toy-like figurines that are used in Chinese funerary practice. And this is from the early Qing tombs, the use of funerary clay sculpture. So these sculptures, are they in the same tradition? Or as Barnhart, Richard Barnhart, the art historian Richard Barnhart and Lucas Nico argued, because they are so out of the Chinese tradition, they must have came somewhere. And this somewhere, they refer to the Hellenistic influence in Central Asia, in Persia, in Afghanistan. I'll come back later, because this period of the formation of the First Empire, there's lots of communication between East and West. But I think methodologically, I think there's a problem in Richard Barnhart and Lucas Nico's argument, because they use the lack of evidence as evidence. And there are 2 aspects. The one aspect is the size. The huge size, the life size of sculpture of terracotta army is unique in early China. And second, it's realism or naturalism, whatever the term you want to pick, because they are so real. First, I'll talk about this scale, the size. My argument, actually, I disagree with Richard Barnhart and Lucas Nico's argument. I think this great size, this scale, is exactly because of the building of the empire, the seeking of monumentality in the construction, in the building of the Chinese empire. And this is because we have other archaeological evidence. The state of Qing, who unified China, was a small state, came from northwest of China. And in process of from small state to a unified empire, the rulers of that small state constantly seeking monumentality, big, good size, great size structure. Many of the capital and the above ground architecture destroyed. What we have most abundant evidence is in tomb construction, underground tomb construction. And this is an example of the largest Chinese tomb ever excavated. I have the dimension here. It's huge, and it's rooted in history. So not so much archaeological material came from that site, but the site is very, very big. So this tendency for the Qing to seek monumentality in ever-escalating fashion has prompted some scholars, like my advisor Lothar von Falkenhausen, talk about the Qing as a gigantomania. They like big things. That's, I think, the mentality when they built this, the first Chinese empire. And so what about the realism or naturalism of the warriors? It turned out that the realism or naturalism is not that extraordinary in 3D sculpture. And the method of sculpture making was very different from the Greek, Roman, or the other classical tradition. They were manufactured, used the module system. Each body part was produced in molds in several types, and then all the parts was assembled together. It's a typical method of craft production in Chinese, in early China. And this is the famous book by Lothar Lederhorst on the module system in Chinese art. And the cover of his book is the Terracotta Army. He did the research. So this is, although they look like individual configuration, actually they belong to certain types. and different types of body parts put together to form individual statue. And these are the types of hands. So all the body parts are made the module massively produced in this module system, then combined together. So in addition, in early Chinese art, human figure is not a very prominent subject. This is very different from the classical tradition. So there's no lack of a realistic 3D animal sculptures in China. So realism is not a big issue. It's whether or not you want to reach that kind of realism. So this is elephant for Nicholas. It's these are Han, the distance between the Terracotta Army and the Han Yangling is about less than 100 years. If the crafts knowledge was accumulated in the realistic skill was accumulated in the construction of first emperor's Terracotta Army, I guess this knowledge will not be lost. Just because in traditional society, traditional China, this kind of craft tradition persists a long time. You can in the craft tradition, but they produce a very different kind of statue of sculpture in Han Dynasty. In traditional China, there's no such unique sculpture like Terracotta Army. So in early China, there's also some kind of image magic or image taboo that the respect for and the supreme God was not depicted in material form. To have an image is to have been controlled. So this is very different from the Greek, Roman, ancient Egyptian, and other early civilizations. There was a human figure in early China, but they are often people of lower social status. They're criminals, they're enemies, they are the social other. So because of this reason, the function of sculpture, they are all funerary figurines, and the method of manufacture and the material of clay modeling, I think the Terracotta Army still belong to the same artistic tradition. Only the extraordinary characteristic of Qing gigantomania made the Terracotta Army special. Thus, monumentality played an essential role in the production of Terracotta Army and in the establishment of the Qing Empire. So this is the first case. The second example is the imperial capital planning in Qing and Han Empire. Here, monumentality of the capital city, Xianyang, and Chang'an in modern-day Xi'an reflect in their emphasis on the verticality and cosmological symbolism. They are the pivot of the four quarters. They are the celestial city, the center of the empire, and the center of the world. As many scholars have pointed out, the great change in the warring states period before the empire in urban and burial construction is the rise of architecture form manifest ruler's power through emphasis on verticality. The Chinese structure began to build high and high. So I stolen some image from Professor Steinhardt's book, recent book. So the raised platform, Tai, or the terrace pavilion, Ge, the pillar gate, Que, or the tower, all become major elements in the spatial construction of a political power. These structures provide visible sign of ruler's power, were also tool of invisibility. They masks the ruler's person while making his presence known, demonstrating his ability to scrutinize his subjects without himself being observed. The image of the ruler as an all-seeing eyes that was itself invisible anticipating by 2 millennia Foucault's discussion of the panopticon effect. You're being observed. Right? So, there's also a famous passage in Siji. The study of early Chinese architecture, monuments, is kind of difficult because the Chinese architecture, most residential architecture was made of clay, wood, or sometimes brick later in the Han Dynasty. So we don't have much above ground structure. We often have diagrams, foundations, or clay tiles. But the Chinese record is very important. The Han Shu Siji, the Chinese record, gives us lots of information about this structure and also the reception, people's emotion, people's response to this architecture. So it's a very, very valuable resources for study early Chinese architecture. So in this Siji paragraph, Sima Qian talked about when first emperor built the city of Xianyang, the Qing capital, in the imitation of the heavenly apex, the northern pole star. So here building a celestial city on the ground. And this is also closely related religiously. The first emperor deified himself. He proclaimed he is a divine being. So this go along with all these, the program of this imperial program. So the emperor built many palaces, pavilions, and in order to conceive himself, he also built warded roads. Warded roads, covered walks, elevated walks, Morgan's topic here. In imitation of the way in which the heavens, a corridor lead from the heavenly epic star across the Milky Way to the royal chamber star. So the telestial structure is in the imitation of what the Chinese conceive as the heavenly bodies. So replica of the palaces and state conquered by Qing, the replica of the palaces of the state conquered by Qing were built along the northern bank of the Wei River, linked by elevated walks and fenced pavilions. The walked road, covered walks, elevated walks are all tool of invisibility. A master of esoteric arts advised that to achieve immortality, the first emperor had to move in secret and to avoid evil spirits, and instruct him to never let others know the whereabouts of the emperor. So the emperor connect all his palaces and towers with elevated walks and warded roads. Anyone who revealed the emperor's whereabouts at any time was to put to death. So the first emperor's withdrawal, although presented in Siji as a consequence of paranoia and obsession with immortality, it's actually demonstrated that one purpose of verticality, the elevated towers, the walkways, was to render the person of the ruler invisible. The second point I want to make, to discuss, is the connection with the monumentality, the connection between monumentality and the cosmological of the Qing and Han imperial capital. Arthur Wright and Paul Whitley and Professor Steinhardt, they all discussed about the important feature of Chinese imperial cities, the connection between imperial city and cosmology. But when this practice started, scholars have different views about when the earthly Chinese city was linked with the terrestrial conception. So Sima Qian told us about this, that they all started with the first emperor of Qing, which I just quoted. after unification, he deified himself, proclaimed he is the Augustus, he is the August emperor. When he designated his title, there's a discussion between his ministers and emperor. The minister, in the past, we have all sorts of the Augusts, the emperors, the kings, and the first emperor, he want to be the highest. He combine all of them together to create a new title of Huangdi. Now he translated the emperor, actually more than just the English term of emperor. It's the highest ruler in terrestrially and also celestially. So he is deifying himself. And the Han capital planning, the Han Dynasty capital planning follow the Qing practice. So Chinese archaeologists have done extensive archaeological work in Xi'an, excavating these sites. But as I said, these are all foundations. It's not very much, there's lots of information, but it's very difficult for us to pin down some point. But in 1993, a research team in Shanxi province found a cross-access that could be plotted to connect the archaeological remain of Xianyang on the west to a site in the east coast of the emperor. So this is from Professor Steinhardt's book, and this is the original archaeological report. So the archaeological remain of Xianyang can connect with this. And theoretically, although these sites was not found. So what the first emperor is planning is indicate the Xianyang is the center of the empire, the four limits of the Qing Empire. And he also toured the conquered empire and erect inscriptions on all these commemorative inscriptions on all these sites. So this is the idea of the practice of using. We have archaeological evidence or more concrete evidence that the connection between the imperial city capital planning and the cosmology are linked together. Another example is this one. In the Han Dynasty capital, a straight line could be drawn northward from the south of the Han capital Chang'an, and through the south central gate, through the northern central part of the central access of the city, and all the way to the north part. In that area, there's a huge artificial man-made depression. And near this depression, they also have 5 architecture platform remain. So the investigators think that this is some kind of shrine that probably sacrificed to some kind of god. But actually further study indicate this is architecture enactment of the auspicious omens that brought up the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty, the legitimacy of Han Dynasty, you need to have sign from heaven. And this is the sign that 5 planets joined in the Eastern Well. Eastern Well is one of the 28 celestial lodge on the Chinese sky. So when 3 planets line together, there are some important political things happen. The founding of Han Dynasty. So, because scholar was debated about the planning of Han Chang'an. Han Chang'an was following the Qing Chang'an. Is hectically construct together, or whether or not it's clearly planned. So this indicated that they actually have a very clear planning behind this construction. And these omens, auspicious omens, the 5 planets joined in the East Well, was recorded in in 史记, Hanshu, in all these records, but also archaeologically excavated among one day silk manuscript, early Han Dynasty manuscript. There's one divination text is exactly talking about how the divination about the 5 planets, and that there's one entrance. And this is also dynastic auspicious. This is a textile of later Han Dynasty, and on this discovered in Xinjiang in Chinese Central Asia, and on this textile there's an inscription: the 5 planets joined together. This is auspicious sign, auspicious omen for China. So the point I want to make is the monumentality of the Qing and Han capital was closely linked with the cosmological plan, and these cosmological plan, it's related to the legitimacy of the dynasty, according to the Chinese understanding. So here, actually, this side is the modern Xi'an area, the Qing Palace, the Han Palace, and the modern Xi'an and Terracotta Army in this area. So I think we all a parallel comparison could be made by about Imperial Chang'an, Han Imperial Chang'an, and the Imperial Rome in the Roman Empire. I think the famous book we all read in grad school, Paul Zanker's The Power of Image in the age of Augustus. And in the age of first emperor, in the age of the Qing Han Empire, you have similar kind of phenomenon happening in China, only with the exception of the image. Right? The image is not presented in the image of the emperor is concealed in all these imperial complex. So these archaeological discovery indicate that not only the individual structure, palaces, pavilions are imitation of heavenly body, but also the capital plan itself signify the cosmological symbolism. The first emperor of Qing and Liu Bang built the eternal city, a monumental celestial city on Earth. And this parallel with the Roman example. So the third example I want to talk about is the stele. The Wu Hong and his Chinese translator used to translate the monumentality, like the character of the commemorative stele. I think that because of time constraint, I will not talk about into details. But the point about the monumentality in early China, it seems to me at this stage of my research, I think the concept of monumentality in early China bifurcate in 2 directions. One is in emphasize the grandeur, the scale, the size of Chinese architecture, and the other is on the commemoration. Remember, for example, the Terracotta Army, this scale, this large scale grandeur effect, but they are underground. They are forgotten by the Chinese. Only in 1974, the farmer digging archaeological wells in the field accidentally discovered. No one knows in history the existence of Terracotta Army. So this contrast in the monumentality are very different from the Western notion of monumentality. These 2 sides are joined together. But I think in the Chinese case, they are the bifurcation of these aspects. But the China do have this monumental, commemorative aspect. This in the commemorative steles. So this is the Eastern Han Dynasty, the stele, and when Buddhism introduced into China, the Buddhist art was also cast in this Chinese form. And even in Tang Dynasty, in later period, when the Nestorian religion, Nestorian church established in China, when they commemorated their religious events, also used in Chinese form. This is the Nestorian stele that discovered in China. So the development of Chinese stele from first emperor of Qing's proclaimed in all these mountains in his imperial tour to later Eastern Han steles, this evolution is a very important part of the development of monumentality. And also, that comparison could be made about steles and inscriptions. You have monumentality and the anti-monumentality. So this is my conclusion. And my project, it also have a methodological one. When I talk about the Lucas Nicol and these art historians' argument about the influence of Hellenistic influence in China, I think this is a methodology issue here. Certainly, as I said, in the formation of Qing Han Empire is the period of the established connection between East and West, China, Central Asia, and the classical West, the starting of the Silk Road. But the progress are gradual. And we need to very carefully look at the evidence in each case. My estimation in the Qing period, in the early Han Dynasty, the influence of Hellenistic influence have not reached China that far yet. But later on, in the Han Dynasty, after the Han Di, the Han martial emperor, opened up the western part of China, then you have diplomatic campaigns between China and Central Asia empires, states, polities, and that connection can be established on Chinese documentations. And I think for different period, our mode of argument for making this connection probably also needed to change. This is an ongoing project, and I hope the result of this exercise can also help me to figure out better ways to make an argument in this kind of situation where material evidence or historical record is very rare, but the visual, the formal connection is there. How we establish this kind of connection in our scholarship. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Guolong. Now we have the pleasure of hearing from Nancy Steinhardt, who is Professor of East Asian Studies and Curator of Chinese Art at the University of Pennsylvania. She has broad research interests in the area of art and architecture in China and China's border regions, especially the problems resulting from the interaction between Chinese art and that of peoples of the North, Northeast, and Northwest. She's published widely, including more than 100 articles and 9 books, of which I will only mention the 2 most recent, being Chinese Architecture, A History, published in 2018, and Traditional Chinese Architecture, 12 Essays of 2017, both put out by Princeton University Press. She's currently working on 2 book projects, provisionally titled Yuan, Chinese Architecture, Mongol Patrons, and The Borders of Chinese Architecture. In support of her work, Nancy has been recipient of prestigious grants and fellowships, including from the Guggenheim, the Getty, the National Endowment for the Humanities, among many others. Her curatorial and activities and collaborations are international, and they've included exhibitions not only at Penn, but also at the Asia Society, the Metropolitan Museum, the Chicago Art Institute, and other art museums. So please join me in welcoming Nancy.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to come to the Getty and to Los Angeles. let me get to, there we go. Even on a rare day when the weather's nicer in Philadelphia than it is outside today. But thank you very much for this opportunity. The first talk that we heard this morning in some ways could not have been a better setup for what I'm about to try to do. I heard somebody say as I was coming in, well, I need a map for your talk. No, you won't need a map, but the map is actually the terms space, temporality, immobility, philology, and non-performative stage set. Those themes actually, I hope, will all come out in the talk that I'm about to give. So, monumentality in Chinese architecture probably calls to mind these two powerful visual images, the poster pictures of Chinese architecture, indeed of China herself, and the ones through which the fundamental principles of construction and planning are articulated, from enclosure to courtyards, axiality, symmetry, or the importance of gates. Those who keep up with the literature of the field, as you've just heard, in particular, graduate students think of Wu Hong's book when the word monumentality comes up, what he writes and what perhaps he should have written instead, or what he actually meant. And they dissect the reviews of the book as much as the text. Fortunately for architecture, there is a very clear definition of monumentality. There's one for the patron and there's one for the builder, and the patron has to sanction that monumentality, which is defined by his fiat, even if actually he personally never promulgated it. Monumentality is defined in China's primary, singular, and unique architectural treatise, the Building Standards. Chinese name is Ingzao Fa Shi. I'll call it the Building Standards, compiled under the leadership of a court official who was working for the Directorate of Construction. His name was Li Jie. He lives 1035 to 1110. The directive to compile this text is issued by the ultimate codifier of Chinese civilization, the famous Emperor Huizong, who used to come to court himself and paint. As people often say, he painted while his capital burned, and there are some parallels there. But he compiled the record of famous painters of his generations, and he also gives the order to compile the 34-chapter building standards, the last 6 of which have been illustrated. The first 2 chapters of this book are a glossary. They're a glossary of the 48 most important Chinese architectural terms. And the third term in that glossary is this one that I have on the screen. It's pronounced dian, and we define it as large hall. The definition, or better expressed, the relevant explanation or context of dian is drawn from 9 classical Chinese texts. In other words, the classical tradition, the classical Chinese literary tradition, defines architectural monumentality. So 3 examples. Mencius on the left, disciple of Confucius, who lived at the end of the 5th century BCE, writes that all construction of the government or its buildings follows rules. Can't really be more explicit than that. And embedded in Mencius's essay are the 5 necessities for an artisan: carpenter square, compass, line marker, water leveler, and suspended weight string. The Rituals of Zhou tells us that the numinous hall is 9 chur, and this chur is a standard length of a mat. You would think of it as tatami mat. If you've ever rented an apartment in Tokyo, you're told how many tatami mat occupy the floor. That actually traces back to the Rituals of Zhou, where buildings are defined by the length and width of a mat. And it's there that the principle of module, which is probably the most important principle in Chinese architectural mentality, is established. Another text, it's called the Arya. It's hard to translate. It means something like approaching elegance, has 80 architectural terms that are glossed And so Arya on the left, and the picture on the right is a kind of amazing drawing of most of them to predict what a building from the first millennium BCE might have looked like. Many of these terms are still used in the building standards. The closest predecessor to the building standards comes from the middle of the 8th century rules of construction and repair. Interesting that repair is also a fundamental concept. So the top, you see the excavation site. The right, the bottom, the way that the building has been generated based on extant buildings, but also based on the building standards of the 12th century. For instance, something that the rules of construction and repair say is that an eminent hall, a dian, should have a caisson or coffered ceiling, and none of those survives, at least above ground, from the 8th century, but by the time one comes to the 10th century, without a doubt, eminent halls have caisson ceilings. So dian, the large hall, it's actually a 2-character word, dian tong, what you see at the top, and tong is the kind of ambiguous word that just means hall. It's the dian that's in front of it that's important. When a eminent hall is more than 1 story, as you see below, then we can call it a multi-story eminent hall, but those rules are also prescribed in the text. For instance, pillars have to be the primary support. Sometimes there are walls, but support relies on the pillars. And as you're seeing in the lower images, when something is multiple story, it's just pillar, bracket, set layer, pillar, bracket, set layer. It's just one on top of the other with wood, tenon together to make the structure work. So these are the eminent hall. And then the building standards tells us what is a less eminent hall, and that's what you're looking at below. And contrast includes counting parts and counting size of bracket sets. And there are many less eminent halls available to be seen in China. The one on the right was built in the 11th century, but it has brick facing holding it up. And then the building standards tells us that there are 2 more kinds of Chinese buildings. The third type can be translated as an ordinary building or an ordinary residence. One sees those all over the Chinese countryside on the left. And on the right, the building standards gives a special character, a special recognition for a pavilion with a pointed roof. Pavilions always somehow attract the interest of builders. Now, whether someone is familiar with the building standards or not, somebody here, somebody standing in front of these buildings and realizing that she doesn't have an lens wide enough to take it, so she has to figure out how to get the picture. Someone from any vantage point probably is going to call the 2 buildings that I just showed you monumental. They are 2 of the largest buildings that stand in China. The one you're looking at here is approached by a 32.5 by 18.5 meter ramp, and it measures 53.75 by 29 meters. That is more than 176 feet across the front. Second largest building, that's this one, is a mere 48 by 25 meters elevated on a 3-meter platform. Now, what about the Forbidden City, and what about the Hall of Supreme Harmony? Well, in principle, it was even larger. The building that you see here is 64 meters across the front, but this is the 4th version. And we're told that the one that was built in the early decades of the 15th century was 1.5 times larger than what you see here. In any case, the buildings of the Forbidden City are also guided by a construction manual. This one has a few dates in it. The earliest is 1727, 1734 is another year that one reads in the text, and there are names of buildings, and they include buildings that were constructed at the Imperial Gardens outside Beijing today. There was a belief in the 17th century that what was being built was largely indistinguishable from what was being built in the 11th century. That is definitely not true. But believe it or not, the documentation for the 11th century is better. And so I turn back there right now. The building standards tells us explicitly concerning all rules in wooden construction, Tsai, that is the module, is the ultimate in importance. Tsai is the proportion of the height to the width of a Chinese bracket set, and the ideal proportion is 3:2. So this is one of the pages in the building standards that shows you the ranking of bracket sets, and this shows you the ranking from 1 at the highest to 8 at the lowest, and the 15 by 10 module of the bracket arm is the operative here. And in fact, when every piece of a building is measured from the 9th century, there is a diantong, and that's this building. And from the 10th century, there is a dian pavilion, or that is this building. And so you're looking here at the bracketing, and this is the caisson ceiling that I showed you. And the reason that it's so important to measure is because every piece of wood is cut by human hands. So when I say measuring, that means that people still today, when a building is falling apart or getting repaired, measure every single component that's the same, and they take the average. So these two buildings really have the correct module, and the bracket sets, as I said, demonstrate it. So what about this building, which is another one that many people probably know? It's so famous and so large, it's just called the Timber Pagoda in Chinese or in English. It's built in the year 1056. It's built by an emperor, and it's built to memorialize his father, and every component of this building has also been measured. And it turns out it's close, but it's not a perfect diantong. The module here is 25.5 by 17, so very close to a 3:2 ratio. On the other hand, there are 56 different types of bracket sets, and there are multiple levels. There are 4 levels inside and 5 on the outside, as you see on the top. So the feat of building it and getting it to stand is probably the reason that it doesn't fit the criteria, probably. This is a perfect diantong. It was built over a 50-year period between 1038 and 1088, and it is, in fact, the purest diantong that survives from the 11th century. And so we have these 3 so-called perfect buildings according to the building standards. The criteria for tingtong, for the second rank hall, also are very clear in the building standards. So the top rank hall has to have a complete column grid and an interior column grid, and that's what you have there, and even in this gate, and also here. But a diantong, a standard hall, whether more than 1 story or not, may have no columns inside or may just have a few. That's one of the major criteria. And in fact, the building standards tells us that there are only 18 frameworks within which a person can construct in order to make a diantong. So that's in the manual too. And it tells you how the frameworks are supposed to be arranged. So again, there's no leeway for change. It's either a diantong or tingtong. So what about these 2 buildings? These 2 enormous buildings built by emperors are not diantong. They are not eminent halls. And the reason why is a reason of interest to our definition of monumentality that we are engaged in here. So one of the criteria is that the bracket sets are not eminent enough. They're 5th rank out of a total possible 8 ranks. The pillars on the exterior are shorter than the ones on the interior, and diantong, they're supposed to be the same height. And sometimes braces rather than bracket sets are used. So maybe we should call them hybrid. And so this takes one of them apart and shows you the pillars and the few braces and so on. Now, one of the explanations for what's going on here is that the patrons were not Chinese. The patrons are Khitan, and they are living in and building in the dynasty called Liao, which is north of the Song dynasty. In other words, contemporary to the time that the building standards were issued, but not built at that time. And after the year 1004, 16 prefectures of North China fell into Khitan hands, and so certainly there are builders who can make a perfect eminent hall. But why didn't the Liao emperors get them? Maybe they didn't understand the building standards. No, this comparison here confirms without a doubt that whoever was building for the emperors of the Liao dynasty understood the building standards. So this is from the tomb, murals inside the tomb. The tomb's been flooded, nothing's there now, but in the 1930s this was painted, and it's believed to be accurate, of one of the Liao emperors. Look how simple the bracket sets are, heavily painted but simple. And the Xiao are the consort clan of the Liao family. So the wives and some of the grandfathers of emperors are Xiao, but only the Yelu ever get to rule. Look how complicated the bracket sets are. Whoever the Xiao hired to build for them made sure that upon entering the afterlife, the all-encompassing identifying system of Chinese architecture brought them to the next time around as the eminent, and the emperors of Liao, whether they knew it or not, did not have the most eminent bracketing underground, so maybe they didn't get it above ground either. So here's the chart that one uses. You can see the complexity on the left and the lack of complexity in spite of decoration on the right. This was known already in the 1930s, and this man is one of the people responsible for doing a lot of the hands-on measuring. He measured the 2 buildings that I called hybrids, and he measured the pavilion that we've looked at, and he also measured the Timber Pagoda. He did it under the direction of these 2 men, older than he and old enough to have studied abroad. The man on the right, Liang Sicheng, a man whose name many of you know, he's often called the Dean of Chinese Architecture, was his teacher, and Liu Duanzhen studied in Japan, eventually ending up in Nanjing. They were both his teachers. So the measuring was done in the 1930s. Timber Pagodas published 1986, and the other 3 buildings with all their measured parts actually were not published till 2007 and till 2011. But the 2 men on the bottom also were the initiators of the study of the building standards. They probably knew the text by heart. So here is where it gets very interesting. We have on the top 2 eminent halls, and we have below 2 hybrids, but these are 4 buildings from this dynasty that is called Liao. In the 1930s, between 1936 and 1948, the National Museum of the Kuomintang, of the nationalist government in Nanjing, was built. There are 12 names there, but one of the 3 most important names is this man, who is studying the building standards and has seen all of these buildings and has sent out teams to measure them. The model that he chooses are the 2 hybrid halls from the Liao dynasty. So what's going on? He's not, at this point, it's not clear if he's going to be a nationalist or a communist, but he did not fare well under the People's Republic. Unlikely that he would have gone to the building standards and chosen a hybrid system for the National Museum, what was expected to be the National Museum of China. No, what is actually going on is that he once wrote that these two buildings, which are from the Song Dynasty and from the 11th century, made him feel, and they're both perfect yantang, made him feel like he was walking into a Chinese painting. And for the National Museum, he sought austere, bold power. In other words, there's something visual about monumentality. That's something I think worth discussing for this conference. There's a visual definition of monumentality that someone standing in front of a building and walking around it feels. And the way he articulated it was, well, he doesn't want to feel that he's inside of a painting. The Liao happen to have been master builders of physical monumentality. You're looking at, and so I'm turning now in the conclusion to several ideas that I think lend themselves to further discussion, no matter whether we're dealing with China or we're dealing outside China. This is one, so one is the modern context of old monumentality when it's in a text. The second one is this. So the dimensions are the pagoda on the left, 71.3 meters, middle one, the Timber Pagoda, 67.76, and the one on the right, 73.12. And so somebody sort of carelessly, I think, wrote in a book, well, yeah, of course the Liao built huge pagodas, the grasslands are covered with snow, and people need to be able to see where they're going when everything's covered by snow. Well, the pagoda's white, I'm not sure. I don't really think that's the reason that they're so tall, and keep in mind that the Liao accomplished it. What I think the reason is that monumentality, and now I can only speak for China, offers a kind of opportunity for the building that's constructed after it. So there are 5 examples of buildings that are diantang or that are of enormous size that fit what I'm now describing. This one, the facts of this one were known since the 1930s, when that man that I mentioned, Liang Sicheng, climbed to the 2nd story and realized that the eyes of the Bodhisattva project on another pagoda. It's been refaced, but in the 11th century, when it was built, before it was refaced, this is how you see it today, and it wasn't that different in the 1930s. There is a reliquary inside. That's a line drawing of it, Buddhist ashes. So the face of the Bodhisattva projects onto the smaller structure, and we can even see this very direct relationship in a local record. The hall that I was showing you, one of my hybrid halls right here, is 5 kilometers from what was originally an enormous pagoda. This is a reconstruction drawing of a monastery in the same prefectural town. This white pagoda, which is one of the most fantastic monuments I think I've ever seen, is 14 kilometers from the imperial tombs of the Liao rulers. And here you can see it plotted on a map. So here's the white pagoda, and here are the tombs. And I think that the one is built so that the others will receive the protection. That's the way that I'm suggesting this worked, of the large monument. This is Korea, and I am in this, this is a monastery that was built over a 200-year period. What you're looking at here is the 8th century plan. The pagoda doesn't survive, but it would have stood right here. So here's the gate, and if you look right here, you are 390 meters from the pagoda, and this is the monastery behind it, much smaller, and it was built second. And I think probably if someone can plot out where tall buildings stand in China, and I'm just saying tall now, we can decide if we should call them monumental. The distance here is about 50 kilometers, and the building on the left is the sacred central peak of China, and the right, the tallest building in the capital at this time, and they are both patronized by the same Empress Dowager. My next aspect of monumentality is the greater expression of the module. And this is where my thinking to this phrase that we heard in the first talk, stage set for, well, I'm going to say stage set for the emperor. It turns out that the city of Beijing was built with every inch of it laid out according to a module. The number 9 is implicit. If you count across or below, you will count a number of 9s. But for instance, the outer wall of the Forbidden City is 753 meters east-west by 961 north-south. The distance between the outer edges of the northern wall of the Forbidden City and the northern wall of the outer city, 2,900 meters, as opposed to the distance from the outer edge of the Forbidden City to the outer wall of the outer city, 1,450 meters. In other words, rounding off and taking into account that every piece is built by human hands, we have ratios of 3-to-1 or 1.5-to-1 in every building or wall in relation to every other building or wall here, and other times we have a 9-to-1 module. This is all written out, and I'm doing this to finish in time, but the same is implied, or same is in place, if we take the Forbidden City and we extend to the components around it, or we do it this way. In other words, if you've gone to the Forbidden City and you walk from the first gate to the last gate, you're walking less than 2 kilometers. But because you're going upstairs, over and down a threshold, inside a small building, over and down a threshold, downstairs, straight stairs, threshold, because the thresholds as well as the stairs are a very clear axis. Almost no one who goes there doesn't say, I felt breathless. This is the module I'm suggesting here. This is the module working to create monumentality, and this is also the module or architecture working as a stage set, and in this case, is for the performance of the emperor. The buildings themselves are made of thousands of pieces of very straight timbers, but the experience is created through the module. The next thought that I have, those who study Chinese art often use the word orthodoxy. And I could build a case for using the word orthodoxy in how Chinese architecture is supposed to be constructed. Again, there's often a text guiding us. Chinese painting has a very clear set of standards for a group of painters who are known as the Orthodox masters, and what they're supposed to do is laid out earlier in the 17th century and implemented into the 18th. And these are some of the Orthodox masters, and there are also handbooks or guidebooks behind them. But what I'm really suggesting here about the arts of China, and we saw this in Lai Guolong's talk also, is that the written word is so supreme that even in paintings that we like to look at for painting, the purpose of this painting is the word, and the image decorates it. The purpose of the building standards is so that buildings can be built. The purpose of the mustard seed garden manual, or orthodoxy as it's laid out for Chinese painters, is because this very, very rigid set of rules, to the extent that The written word is necessary, and the written word can create space even when it's not historically founded. So that, for instance, some of you have been to Hangzhou, and you know that it builds around West Lake, and this is what the city that Marco Polo saw, and it was destroyed. But the map of the city produced by the next dynasty for all time afterward built it as a perfect city, as the kind that you've just heard about, with city center of the emperor. In other words, the written word is fundamental to everything that we're talking about. This is the final question that I think is raised by the conference. And so the final point where I would say that I'm on the shakiest ground, but that's why we're all here today. So the Chinese language, classical Chinese language, does not have a word for architect. It has a word for builder craftsman. There are people who build, but China certainly does not have a Phidias. Nothing close. Not even in the Sung dynasty or the Qing dynasty, there are maybe 5 names of builders that come up through history. And what's more, we're dealing with a tradition of perishable material, so that the concept of monumentality has to be construed through these perishable pieces that are cut by human hands, not by enormous pieces of stone that are carried great distances. So the question that I think a person has to ask when we're talking about a tradition that continues as long as China, or a word like monumentality that we're trying to bring outside of, in my case, outside of China, case of others, bring China into the definition, is, did the Chinese ever think about this question of sameness? Now, I, of course, am not an expert on the buildings or the tradition behind the building on the left, but there are people who tell us what sameness is supposed to be. There certainly are biologists. Studies of homology say that the state of having the same or similar structures and homoplasy, that is, shared characteristics, assume evolution, and in the resolution find convergence. In other words, is there change in this Chinese tradition, and is it valid to call it the same even if I have an architectural manual? According to Michael Ray on Aristotle, the problem of material constitution arises when it appears that object A and object B share the same parts and yet are essentially related to their parts in different ways. And to me, this is precisely what the building standards tells us. But is this also true when we look at a tradition like the classical tradition that presents as neoclassical and on a certain level believes itself to be imitating but doing in a better way what the ancients did? Well, again, being trained in China, as the first talk is too, I always have to go back and see if China has a word for sameness. So the first 3 are words that people use just to say the same thing. The bottom is a classical Chinese definition that translates as myriad tablets, one rule. And they have in here tablets. They have in here the written word. So in other words, even if there is translation, I was interested to hear how often Baudelaire came up and today, and we all know what Benjamin had to say about translation. We know what George Steinhardt had to say about translation. Most recently, in 2018, Karen Kohler and Jeffrey Soletnik wrote, "Architecture and/as translation." implies a kind of transformative action that takes place over time as some kind of original something is translated or transubstantiated into something else. In the act of translation, meaning hovers somewhere between the structure and its representation as it leaves the first instance and accumulates into the second. Translation is time-based yet dialogic. Architectural meaning migrates. Now, meaning is not part of of the material that I'm looking at, the pre-modern Chinese material. There are two of the greatest living translators of Chinese, Piri Link, one of them writing in a Festschrift for Victor Mayer, the other writes that challenges whether anything other than a mirror image is true translation. These are all questions that one cannot but ask when looking at a text with pictures that's generated a tradition for so many years and out of which even the definition of monumentality is so clear. So I raise these questions because people who work on a subject like pre-modern Chinese architecture are always trying to get out of this box and see if we can't talk to people who work in other areas, and certainly sameness principle, closed systems, and translation are relevant. But for Chinese architecture, the fact is, for pre-modern Chinese architecture, one doesn't really have to go this far because monumentality is defined in word, it's defined in image, and it's orthodoxy. Thank you.
Maybe I will ask the two speakers if they have any questions for one another before opening it up to the floor.
I just wanted to make one comment. I wasn't at all surprised that Guolong began with the written word, because it's hard to escape it in pre-modern China. In a sense, I did too, because it's there when all the transient material is gone. So that was kind of my only comment about what we heard just now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so Professor Einstein is the authority on Chinese architecture. And my question, you produced recently a history and also about the middle period, and you also go back to Han Dynasty. What do you think the early Chinese architecture that I'm interested in about, and later one, there's any...
Oh, is there a change?
Yeah, what kind of change?
The module changes, although interestingly, again, this measuring of buildings is a pretty tedious task. It's something that graduate students who want to study architecture always spend one summer doing. Yeah, the module definitely changes, but something interesting is that in the 8th century, the module in China and in Korea and in Japan are the same. And that's something that people thought, but it took the measuring to be certain of it. Yeah, I mean, there has to be progress, right? But somehow, whatever framework architecture is put in, it's really just to serve the emperor. And change is defiance of antiquity. And antiquity is such an elevated place in China that I mean, you can read some books, people don't do this anymore, but the books written in the 30s by Liang Sicheng, whom I mentioned, call the period of the Forbidden City as the period of rigidity and the decline of all architecture because it doesn't follow the building standards. So.
I just have a quick and simple question, sort of picking up on this point. Since modularity, as you both seem to say, is key, as you both say, is key to understanding monumentality in Chinese architecture and Chinese monumental art, just for the student such as myself, how far back does the idea of modularity go in China? What is the sort of origin?
I mean, the earliest that I can give you is this quote from the Rituals of Zhou is supposed to describe practices of the first millennium BCE. The version that survives is probably 1st or 2nd century CE. But first millennium, the period that the first talk dealt with, Probably the buildings are based on a module.
And then it travels through what byways to other media, such as?
Well, architecture's, it's in painting is its own system,
Okay.
but it's still rule-based. What's extraordinary is how rule-based it is.
Yeah, in early China, the best example we have is the bronze production. Here's a module system, decoration system. We have piece. So actually, Lothar book extend that to many areas. But our knowledge of the module system came from bronze production, craft tradition.
Great.
That's right, so it's second millennium.
Yeah.
Shall we, I think Morgan was maybe first.
Thanks so much. Oh, architecture. Thanks so much for two really wonderful talks. I actually had questions for both the speakers. First, for Guolong. Your description of the links between architectural design at a grand scale and urban planning as somehow a mirror image of or specular or almost coextensive with a cosmological system was super interesting. And I almost was expecting you by the end to bring that back to the Terracotta army. And so in a sense, so many of the buildings that you talk about reflect a celestial domain, or in the case of that later historian, Sima, not Chen, the other one,
Sima Guang. Yeah.
Guang, yeah, who says that, well, this is just superficial beauty because it doesn't reflect something that's in the heavens, in a sense, right? And so I was wondering whether, in a sense, the Terracotta army, which is buried in the ground, follows a similar logic, but one that's kind of inverted, one that recreates or anticipates a subterranean empire, in a sense. And so that both of these, that the paradigm that you set out is actually productive for rereading the Terracotta army, and it's actually part of the same culture. For Nancy, I had a question about using a Song Dynasty manual as the launching point for reading forwards and backwards. Is there a danger methodologically, perhaps, to finding the one extant treatise?
Well, I mean, you want to answer? I have a simple answer. Buildings have all been measured. The fact is that there no doubt were earlier manuals that don't survive, or pieces of them survive. But if somebody measures a 9th century building and finds the same 3:2 module in the bracket arm, it's not inference. It's by measure. It's this very tedious measuring.
Right. But the
process.
ones that come closest to the quote ideal Diantang or the perfect Diantang are, of course, the ones that come from the Song Dynasty or around the same time. And the farther out you go, they kind of diverge in different ways. And also, there's a perhaps ethnocentrism even to the argument, where the Liao Dynasty stuff is merely described as hybrids and somehow departures from the ideal. So I just wonder whether
I agree with you. I thought about those things. I was trying to challenge myself. The first approximation would be, well, they're not Chinese, they don't get it. But whoever was building for them was Chinese, and they really got it, right? And then in 1930, somebody comes and says, well, they may not be Orthodox, but he uses words like bold, austere, I mean, something that everybody's hearing. Chinese use the word beauty. These are sometimes these are elegance. These are hard to translate. But these are in the classical text. These aren't just things that art historians are or trying to use to explain concepts. They were trying to understand what their explanation of the concept was.
Okay, my answer to your question is absolutely. Yeah, the Terracotta Army, although scholars have different speculations, like what's the purpose of Terracotta Army, but it's for afterlife. The whole Imperial mausoleum compound is for afterlife.
Okay, great. So we'll go to Maristella next. No? Nicholas then. Either one of you. Go ahead.
All right. It's a quick question, mostly because I'm wondering about this. It's similar to what Morgan said in a sense. Are the manuals that kind of set up the module in a way normative or descriptive? In other words, do they try to organize a practice that has emerged through craft?
Absolutely. They say,
or do they regulate it beyond what has been the practice? Because it's almost the opposite.
These are imperial manuals. There's also a how to build a house kind of manual. But this building standard says how many hours a person should work in the summer compared to the winter, because it's hot in the summer. It says how to be cost efficient in transporting of materials. It's so inclusive that a person's not supposed to think outside the box.
Right.
That's the intent.
And in some ways, this brings me to the second part of this question, which is this. It almost complicates the question of authority, of authorship, because it's almost like the building manual. It's almost like the buildings follow the manual. You said we don't have named builders because they follow but these manuals are also authored in a sense.
At court.
Almost at court.
There's a bureau of there's a building bureau. A directorate of building. There's somebody in charge of it. This man, Li Jia, maybe was in charge, maybe he was vice director. And all that a person needs to do to assemble a building is to be told the module. And then the people who cut, and the people who assemble. And this is actually also true in tombs. There are a few very rare tombs. There's one from the first part of the Han Dynasty that has numbers on brick, so that all a person needed to know was the numbers 1 through 20, and he just takes the pieces in and matches them. It's a system for idiots, yeah. Yeah, no, that's why it's important to try to make it interesting and speak outside of China, because anything that you're asking me, maybe I've thought about in trying to bring this outside of China, I keep coming back to the text.
Can I just quickly ask you, does the system you're describing extend beyond the architectural scale to the urban scale even?
Only, so that's why I brought up the Forbidden City.
Mm-hmm. Is that the only?
I don't know of a book that says how the whole city was built, but it's certain, again, because it's all been measured now, that the module, that there is a proportion and everything matches the proportion.
But not beyond the Forbidden City.
For all of China? Well, maybe, you saw those pictures of the pivot of the four quarters, maybe. Right. Ideally. See, that's the thing about having a text and having orthodoxy. There's an ideal. And then people can believe they're following the ideal even if they're not.
Right.
You have to buy into the system. Yeah, it's sinocentric. It's definitely.
Fascinating. Thank you. Elizabeth. Yeah.
So this is actually, I think, a question for both of you in a way, but maybe brings us back to the panel this morning where I think there was a tension that was raised between a monument as being either iterative or singular.
Yeah.
And to move away from the modularity question, which I think is fascinating, I'm interested actually in the idea of multiplicity that both of you brought up. The idea that these monuments are either made up of many multiples or are themselves multiplied. You talked about the sort of pagodas scattered throughout the landscape, the idea of the warriors, which are kind of multiple but seen as a singular monument in a composite way. I'm wondering if either of you can comment on this tension between the kind of singular and the iterative and how it relates to the Chinese concept of monumentality given this idea of the multiple that kind of runs through both talks.
He's looking at me. So again, I mean, the reason I talked about sameness and translation, I thought I would throw them out. They don't exactly work, but people are always, should be asking what you just asked. Anybody who works on Chinese architecture asks it. And I don't think I can give you a satisfying answer because it's the system. The emperor is in charge of it. This is, I mean, what somebody's doing in his house in the provinces is not part of this system. The emperor is the son of heaven. He modulates the world, right? So that's what makes architecture interesting, because it doesn't have great builders, it doesn't have the principle of design. None of this comes till the 19th century. So yeah, but that's the question that we ask. What does it mean for there to be a replica or a module or mass production?
Okay. Okay. So then we are going to go to Dieter. You can...
Yeah. Thank you so much. I probably have a question directed at all of us here, but I was inspired to this question by something Guolong Lai said. When you quoted from this fascinating exchange, sorry for not recalling the names, between the two people when they were discussing building palaces of such an extravagant scale. And why? And so this brings me to the question of what motive actually is behind buildings, monumental buildings. And that's something we haven't really addressed yet properly, I think. And two concepts come to mind here that run into opposite directions, which are triumph and crisis. So on the one hand, you could say, well, you build something that big just because you can afford it, just in order to get the message across to everybody, I'm big. To put it in a very simple way. But another motive could be that just against all odds, you want to build something that persuades those who are kind of shaky. If they do stuff like that, this has to be serious. They have to be stable and so on. And if I'm not sure, I'm obviously not an expert at all, but if I recall the stories about the Summer Palace near to Beijing properly, there was this debate on decadence and overly costly, gigantic marble buildings and so on and so forth. So normally when you talk about China, you would think, well, it's all about triumph. It's all about stability. But this quote that you gave kind of revealed a certain amount of, crisis. And this certainly applies to many stories you could tell about, late antiquity probably, and also about other periods in European history or in the US history for that matter. So I'm kind of curious how both of you probably respond to this alternative between triumph and crisis.
So, I was trying to write a definition of monumentality as I heard the three talks this morning that I thought might come up. So what I came up with, to kind of answer your question, a monument needs a historic past, or it needs a documentary or an apocryphally constructed past. And a monument assumes, somebody used the word historicity, but maybe assumes history, in other words, that it will have a future. And then this idea, monuments define and direct space, kept coming up. But the last talk got us into is a relation to destruction assumed? And I think that's something that maybe an enormous tomb that you look at that's been looted. It wasn't assumed it would be looted, but almost every tomb's been looted. Is there a means of productive destruction? That also came up. For the timber frame, yes. For a Chinese building, destruction, fire, warfare is assumed. That's why there's a manual. It doesn't matter if it burns down. Somebody has spare parts and knows how to rebuild it. So that kind of answered something came up. But this idea of a historic past, I think it's implicit in China.
All right. So we go to Karl Schlober.
I have two questions. The first one is very simple. How can this army of terracotta survive out of this, just the material? How is it possible? And the second, how do we integrate the architecture of modern China? I mean, the 20th century China. And I have in mind going across the Tiananmen Square or along the Shanghai, the Art Deco skyscrapers, etc. How does this, it must be a huge break in the tradition of China. Two questions.
Okay, I think this first question is very interesting. Is it because it's invisible? So it's neglect to preserve. Most of Chinese architecture, Professor Steinhardt knows better than me, were in Shanxi, in the remote area. They're not modernized. People don't pay attention to them. Then they preserve. If they are monuments, everybody knows they will repaint, rebuild it, destroy it. So monument and anti-monumentality go together. You want to build a monument, some people enter this monument. So I think exactly because Terracotta Army was underground, and certainly there's just some destruction in earlier, when archaeologists excavated probably in the wall, the end of Qing Dynasty, the wall already destroyed some part of Terracotta Army. Then they as a ruin, buried underground for almost more than 2,000 years, and the farmer accidentally discovered. And I think that for modern architecture, probably you can ask.
So the Chinese language defines these terms. There's a word for modern, and there's a word for contemporary, and there's a word for architecture of this very day, and there's this very, very day, dong dai dai, dong dong dai. But if you want, my candid comment, it's that we are part of global, international, contemporary architecture, and it doesn't matter who's building it or where it's built, because everyone knows how to build the same kinds of things and aspires for the greatest building that can stand. So I don't have this conflict. China herself decided in the middle of the 19th century, the Opium War is usually the big turning point, considered the big turning point, that she had to modernize. It wasn't easy, but architecture is just part of the process. And what happens in an architecture school in Beijing or Shanghai is the same thing that happens at Penn. Same computer-generated programs and 3D models.
So Guolong says that the buildings that are off isolated are inherently preserved, and Nancy says that we live in an international cosmopolitan world of architecture. My question is, these buildings of ancient China and early modern China, what is their status, and if any, in the sort of contemporary Chinese state building project?
That's the subject of another book project, is heritage conservation. So they are, in the modern period, they be conserved as monuments. So they adopted the Western idea of the past need to be preserved. And all these monuments, Professor Steinhardt visited, designated of historic monuments.
So, you have people very involved in the designation of monuments in China sitting in this audience. But it always involves time, money, and there are Chinese bureaus and there are international bureaus and juries that decide these things together. We're definitely a global world. But yeah, a lot of it happens right here at the Getty. A lot of these decisions are discussed right here at the Getty.
I think we have actually a question from that direction, if we can. Yeah. Yes. Oh, have I? Apologies. Let's go over here. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you too for an excellent panel, and I have a question that actually relates to historiography, especially in relation to 20th century, how Chinese architecture gets rediscovered. And so your pen actually play a very important role, and I thought it was very interesting, Nancy, in your talk, you single out two instances to consider the question of monumentality. One is the question of the module, where you, I think it's a very provocative way to rethink sameness as actually a structural principle that defines and differentiates Chinese architecture from, let's say, Western notion of monuments. And the other is actually, you mentioned by passing the pagoda, and you mentioned that there's a visual aspect of monumentality that we didn't seem to have focused much of our energy on. And I was thinking of the particular role that late 19th century, early 20th century Western study of architecture played in this understanding of the tradition of Chinese architecture. So the obvious example would be Liang Sichen, for example, who studied at UPenn and really, I think he played an important role in rediscovering the Yinzhao Fashi, right? The principles of building that you paid a lot of attention to in your talk. And I think that was itself, that's his own study, but it's also in search of what characterized as the Chineseness of Chinese architecture. And the other one, in terms of the pagoda, historians such as James Ferguson play a very important role in highlighting pagoda among many other Chinese architectural forms as one that is characteristic of Chinese architecture. So we tend to come back to these examples again and again, and I think the study of Liao is a very interesting test case because it really pushes.
I didn't want to do it, but I couldn't help it.
It really pushes the limit, right? You call it hybrid, but really I think it raised a whole question of those standards. So I wondered, I think among this notion of respect to orthodoxy that defines China, it's also very selective history that is so interactive with 20th century Western history of architecture, right, to try to define what Chinese architecture is. So I wonder if there are alternatives to think about other architecture instances and models in China that might raise questions to those building standards.
That's a good question, yeah.
I think here one case is Liang Sichen. I think in 1930s, when the city of Hangzhou tried to rebuild actually study the Liuheta, the pagoda, Liang Sichen made a plan because the pagoda was built historically a Song core. Then the outside is the Qing Dynasty core. At that time, Liang Sichen was studying the classical tradition, the Song. So he thinks the Song one is beautiful, elegant. The Qing Dynasty one is ugly. So he made a plan. Said, take out the out shell and preserve the center one. But this plan was never carried out because of the 1930 Civil War, but later on our idea of monuments changed. It's not because the historic preservation, the historicity, the accumulation of the historic fabric is also a very important part of the monument. So Liang Sichen also have very important change in this process of development of historical heritage conservation in China. And this not only his own as a scholar, but the government policy also changed along that.
In fact, he's responsible for building one of the most perfect buildings according to the module the city of Yangzhou ever built. Yeah, the only perfect buildings, according to the building standards, are computer generated because somebody can take the module and build a whole building. But this question of pagoda, I mean, I think, Liang China, there is a kind of visual monumentality. That's why I showed the Great Wall, not because I had anything profound to say about it, but China's most powerful symbol is the Great Wall. It's a great wall. It's, you know, it walls China in, but I mean, what an expression of, what greater expression of monumentality than this wall that was begun in the Qing Dynasty. Actually, pieces even survive from earlier. So I don't know if there are if there are definitions of or examples of monumentality outside of China that can relate to what we saw here. I mean, the pagoda can be huge. It can be 70 meters. That's a huge pagoda. Kind of extraordinarily huge. So how could it not be monumental? Jeff has had a question.
Thank you so much. My question has morphed as I've been listening to this conversation, so it's not as crystalline as it seemed when I first was thinking about it. But I find fascinating this the definition of monumental, the kind of linguistic work that you've kind of opened up for us about how to kind of get into the contemporary concept of monumentality from a language point of view, a vocabulary point of view, and that it completely does not map onto the Roman case, which is so fascinating for me, because even when we have a definition,
we have here, yes,
right? But
doesn't.
I mean, Varro is the guy who's writing an etymological dictionary of sorts, and he's the one that we and other Latin authors are also referring to, or going back to his definition about the moneo, that sort of warning or, you know, reminding / admonishing concept. And it's all about the effect, the goals, the effect, the roles that monuments play. It's not about characteristics of their form, scale, visuality. And this seems to be a fundamental difference in terms of these two schools of thought about definitions of monuments. So I'm wondering does that, I mean, your definition, the definition that you sort of brought to light for us, is about construction, this module, and it's absolutely fascinating. You're kind of in or you're out. You're on the cusp, you're an eminent building, or you're not. You're a lesser hall. Does another kind of monumentality, maybe with a different word, but does it exist, something that is trying to capture the effect, whether that's the magnificence? I mean, it seems like there's a kind of word cloud of definitions out there that might help us get to these two sides of the kind of ability to construct something that is officially designated in the handbook as a monument, so, and adheres to that.
If no one who
typology.
Wrote about the Pantheon ever used the word monumental, to somebody who studies the material I do, that's extraordinary. But if it's really true, that's also extraordinary, right? If there, I mean, I don't know. I come with very specialized knowledge. There is, to me, it must be some kind of visual monumentality, but maybe not. Maybe not. It puts me the question over there for a long time.
That's a great segue to my question. Thank you very much, because I was intrigued by your use of the Parthenon, because the architects of the Parthenon, Ictinus and Kallikrates, wrote a treatise.
I said Pantheon, because I was
No, I'm talking about your talk.
Oh, I see, okay.
And
yeah.
you mentioned Phidias, but it was the architects are Ictinus and Kallikrates who did write a treatise. And what's interesting to me about the Parthenon is this question that you just raised, which is when I show it, when we do it in Greek archaeology class, students are like, "Oh, it's so big." It's not its size that is monumental. It's proportion, its harmony, its beauty, and in fact, that building, the Parthenon, is built so that every single piece of stone had to be carved individually for its place on the building because of the refinements, because of the curvature of the stylobate, the curvature of the architrave, the inclinations of the column. So it wasn't, I say it's not a Sears catalog temple. You have to build, you can bring the blocks from the quarry individually, or en masse, but individually they have to be carved specially. So that's a case where the monumentality is not in its scale, but in its beauty and proportion, its visual value. And the fact that you encounter it at a 3/4 view is designed to enhance and maximize that experience.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, so
that's what I think we're all hoping will come out of the conversations here.
Great, thank you.
There's
Thank
been
you.
a question up there forever. Which,
Okay.
yeah,
Let's go into question. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, really. This is a wonderful discussion. I wonder whether, in answer to some of the points you just raised, we might come back to one of the first analogies you made, Nancy, with this morning's discussion. You used the word space. We haven't used that word very much in this discussion, but it seems to me that that's really the word that we're hovering around. Instead of architecture as form, it's really architecture as a generator of space. And I found it very interesting in your two papers that in addition to the common denominator, Nancy, you emphasized, that is the written word, and both of you coming back to the written word. But it seemed to me that one of the other curious observations I had from your two talks was the ways that you were both talking about space, but not space internally within a building, but really the relationship between that building and a more cosmic space, or a more ineffable space. The space between, for example, the space between, at Foguangsi, between the Bodhisattva's view and the pagoda, or in Guolong's case, the creation of the axes of the empire across space that links Chang'an to a much larger entity. And I'm just wondering whether this is not also part of this very difficult to define quality of monumentality that you were just talking about, the Parthenon. That there seems to me that there is also this linkage between the physical fabric of the tsai, of the module, of the micro level building, and the more macro level cosmos, which is epitomized by the emperor himself as the son of heaven, and the relationship, and certainly in Chinese architecture, and I would probably argue in most other architectures, between some sort of cosmology at a macro level, and then the more formal aspects of architecture that we're much more familiar with at the micro level. So it's just, this is more of an observation than a question, but I think I bring it in because it seems to me part of this larger discussion we've been having with these questions.
Do we have any other questions from there we go.
Thank you. Yeah, my question builds a little bit on some of these ideas, and it also speaks to this question of the way in which monuments engage us on a very human kind of sensorial way. And I'm wondering how useful the concept of the uncanny might be in relation to trying to explain monuments, for the most part representing the human form. I had the good fortune to visit the Terracotta warriors, and for me there was this very uncanny sensation of their sort of heightened verisimilitude versus the kind of mass and their status as a monument. So my broader question is, I wonder how useful, as a kind of way of just digging into the kind of psychic reverberations of monumentality, this concept might be in explaining how we react to the giant hands of a monument, or the feet, or these very human reactions to the body, but also in negotiation with obviously the very didactic functions of the monument. So I wonder, did you similarly have an experience of the uncanny, or is it just a concept that comes with too much baggage?
I think the idea of body, and this is very deep in Chinese philosophy, like Taoism, the most powerful are not in material form, the invisible. So certainly in our modern experience, you look at the terracotta army, the form, but I think the traditional Chinese philosophy or this kind of view, it's like like a Dao De Jing Lao Zi kind of thing. It's the most powerful thing did not reflect themselves. So the emptiness, like hidden things. In Japanese Buddhism too, Macaulay talk about the most sacred image is hidden. No one sees this image, but it's so powerful. So that aspect, I think, not unique, but I think is very, very prominent in China and in Japan, in East Asia too,
Great. Any more? Any more? Any closing ideas? Okay, in that case, I think we'll thank both of our speakers and go on break.